Alicia Seiger is a lecturer at Stanford Law School and leads sustainability and energy finance initiatives at Stanford Law School, the School of Business, and the Dorr School of Sustainability. I think she's pretty smart. Let's welcome her to Climate One. Please welcome. Good to see you. Thanks. Great to have you here, Alicia.
Thanks for having me.
It's nice to see you in person. I think we've been talking on Zoom for too long.
Yeah.
You edited a book titled Settling Climate Accounts, The Road to Net Zero. That term, net zero, is important. We hear it from companies. We hear it from nation states, from governments. So it's one of these things that's thrown around a lot. I'm not sure people really understand what it means, kind of like regenerative agriculture. A lot of people use it, but they don't really know what it means. So what does net zero really mean, and how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, here's a confession. I don't know what it means actually in practice. Which
Wait,
is
you wrote a book about it.
I know. Well, we wrote a book about how practitioners are going to struggle to make it add up. And so just to start, for those who aren't familiar with what net zero means, it's this idea of by a certain date, your net emissions you produce minus the emissions you remove, will be zero. The term really launched into the sort of common discourse after the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change group of global scientists that work on consensus, published a special report on staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. And that's where this concept really emerged from, was to build strategies around science and science-based targets. And that's where net zero came from. And as we explore in our book, we take accounting in sort of the triple sense of the word, looking at accounting as storytelling, telling accounts of the history of climate action, and then accounting as the technical exercise of bookkeeping, and then accounting with account as the root of accountability, and how are we going to make this all add up. And so in understanding how we arrived at net zero as the dominant organizing principle of climate action, we looked back at the last 30 years of what's gone on, and just quickly, the highlights to note, or the original idea was we were just going to have a carbon tax, right? We would put a price on the externality, and that would solve the problem. But
pay for pollution.
Right, pay for the externality. Governments around the world weren't able to get the political will and the consensus around that. And so drivers of climate action who emerged as corporate leaders and NGOs and investors started to try and take some detours here. And so the first detour was this idea of green finance, that we're going to buy our way into a stable climate by having the clean stuff cost less than the dirty stuff. Mm-hmm. And so that actually kind of worked in the energy sector. We now have power, the clean power, that is less expensive than dirty power. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that with batteries too. But the problem with that green finance idea is that we've got all these other sectors of the economy where it is more expensive to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And so we had to make another detour, this idea of a turn to risk, which is this idea that if we invert the lens and we use risk as a means to reprice things, maybe things will work out that way. And that ran into challenges in that risk can be transferred, right? You had your state representatives here. The state of California has been left holding the bag on cost of wildfires and disaster relief and healthcare benefits and unemployment benefits. So private sector can move that risk around.
Right, private sector has been privatizing the profits and pushing the cost and the risk onto the public and the taxpayers, right?
That's right. And then you have these justice issues where if you look purely through a risk lens, you run the risk of, no pun intended, of climate redlining, where there are just areas where you don't invest because it's too risky. And so we arrived at net zero because it steers around these difficulties of green finance and risk. It sort of ignores the complexities of, what Bill Gates will call a green premium, of things that are more expensive. And in managing risk, it sets up this process of aligning emissions with normative targets that looks like risk management, but is a different exercise than actually managing risk.
Okay, so we started out to make green cheaper. That worked in some areas. Electricity from solar is now cheaper than coal, but then there's risk areas that there's problems there. So it ended on net zero, and that's what you said, the central organizing principle of governments and companies trying to solve climate. Okay, we got to get to zero. Zero is now not a loser. It's a positive thing. You and your co-author wrote, climate accounting as a narrative falls into two genres: pep rally optimism and dystopian despair. Describe those narratives and what you think is the true story.
Ooh, yeah, we were chatting about this a little bit. I mean, it's hard, right? There's a wonderful podcast called Outrage and Optimism that I think holds this, that Christiana Figueres that is one of the co-hosts of, that holds this tension well, because there is that you kind of need both. And at the same time, to make progress, you need neither. You need sort of the sober, with analytical rigor, facts and analysis-based innovation around progress. And so, along with that hope and despair comes heroes and villains, too, as part of the storytelling of where you want to hold up a certain set of actors and wrap them in green capes, and you want to give another set of actors, spears and weapons. And the reality is it's much more complicated and nuanced than that, and some things that are done in pursuit of goodness aren't necessarily in service of the ends that we all are hoping for. And some of the actors on the evil side are responding to incentives, and would when they come home to their families on the weekends very much like to be doing the things that that would be in service of climate stability, but they have incentives and shareholders and stakeholders who are pushing them in other directions. And so what we really need to do is develop innovations and align capital so that there is clear incentives and price signals and policy that are steering us in the direction of decarbonization.
So what I hear you saying there is good people are playing a game in a system with the rules of which are not serving them or us well. We need to change the rules of the game, because we have people who are nice soccer dads and moms, but they're going to work for fossil fuel and finance companies that incentivize them to do bad things because that's how they get, that's the game, shareholder value, right? So we need to change those rules, and then those people will be able to do what they really are yearning to do?
Well, and by the way, it's not just the people who work for oil and gas companies, it's all of us, right? We buy plastics, we get on airplanes, we drive cars. Like, we're all complicit in...
And we don't pay the cost of the pollution of our
Right,
plastic.
right.
Yeah, right, okay. Right, okay, so if we change the rules, then the people will follow. And you think that, accounting is a way to do that. It's sort of changing the rules, and we also need to change the accounting. And so tell us about that. Why, it gets nerdy pretty fast,
Yeah.
but why does it matter? We need to change the rules and change the numbering.
So it does. I always like to tell the story about accounting, because you may have all just fallen asleep as we said the word, because I remember my first year business school, I came from a startup background, and I was sitting next to one of my now dear friends who was a teacher, and we were a couple weeks into the accounting class, and she turns to me and said, "I'm so glad we decided to take Mandarin," because we had no idea what was going on or ability to. So, I mean, I get it. It's not a sexy topic. It's not something people spend who aren't doing it a lot of time on. But the reality is, now talk about handing out capes. Like, I really do think accounting is the foundation on which we can achieve our climate goals. And if we go back to net zero, I also sort of like to joke, net zero is the dominant organizing principle, with net zero and the disclosure regime as the bad garage band that is trying to make this all happen. And so in the implementation of net zero, we have this tool of disclosure to try and make these targets line up. But there is a difference between disclosure and accounting. And accounting, again, at the risk of boring people, is where you count everything and only once, using principles that have been used for centuries and battle tested across all kinds of markets and market manipulation, and globally standardized in practices that can be understood and implemented. And so once we kind of evolve our toolkit towards accounting principles, we can start to measure. The idea of disclosure is you manage what you measure, but if those measurements aren't auditable, comparable, continuous, and in specific, you can't employ the management techniques that one would like to have.
Right. So some people would say that more disclosure is always better, right? Because there's sort of presumption that fossil fuel companies are evil and doing things and kind of hiding what they're doing and not really disclosing how much is going out the smokestack or how much they're dumping into a river. And so more disclosure is yes, disclosure is good. Bring transparency to this murky, evil world of energy. Do you agree that more disclosure is always better?
I think some disclosure is good. I think it quickly falls into a careful what you wish for kind of scenario. So when we were operating in a voluntary world with corporate leaders looking to make decisions about their products, for material sourcing, or the implications of products downstream, or which suppliers on margin, to choose from, or what kind of energy to purchase, there was real value there, and I think that should be recognized. We also, I would come back to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was a multi-stakeholder designed framework for measuring and managing climate risk, which defined these 4 areas of governance and strategy and risk management and metrics and targets. And you need information for boards and executives to, apply that framework in a useful way. What gets sort of a little messy is there are different uses for disclosure, and there are different stakeholders where disclosure is useful. So in the context of a government, for example, I had the pleasure of serving as the co-chair of the Climate Risk Disclosure Advisory Group for the state of California, which looked at this information in the context of the state budget and in its investment portfolios. And when you're trying to decide where to locate the next, infrastructure, place-based infrastructure, having disclosure on physical climate risk really matters. It's going to change.
Where should we build this road or bridge? Is it going to be washed away by sea level rise? That sort of thing. Okay.
And there's increasingly now, both behind paywalls and thanks to Probable Futures and organizations like that, information on physical risk that's for free and available for governments to use. So that really changes decisions in capital allocation. Where disclosure, I think, can run into challenges is on this sort of the transition risk side, where you're talking about how companies and economies and countries move from high carbon intensity to low carbon intensity. And what we have been using is the greenhouse gas protocol to furnish that information. And because the protocol was built as a risk management tool when we thought we were going to have a carbon tax, and you would want to know where your risk was coming from in these different, your direct emissions or your electricity emissions or your supply chain up and down. Now we're in a different kind of context where we want to understand, how to compare different companies, different products, different materials through a supply chain, and that's where disclosure isn't fit to purpose for the kind of capital allocation decision making that we are hoping is going to happen in the context of these disclosure regulations.
That sounds like, does that position get you some flack from some people who are in your world who think that all disclosure is good? I mean, has that lost some friends over that?
I have lost some friends over this, which makes me so sad. So just a little bit, my background, I, as an undergrad, designed my own curriculum in cultural anthropology and environmental science and policy. I was really transfixed by this question of the relationship between humans and natural systems, and then businesses and sustainability, and now climate and capital markets. I serve on the board of an environmental advocacy organization. I have been everyone's green friend for 3 decades. I have some green cred. But what has emerged in the context of a much larger stage of political food fighting and distance from facts and fake news, there's just a lot of noise out there, and so people are losing their ability, especially in the context of an issue like climate, which is really scary and urgent and existential, to hear new information and to receive constructive criticism or curiosity or questions that threaten.
Well, we all have
quo.
confirmation bias. We let facts in that support our worldview, and facts that challenge our worldview, we kind of, we let them bounce off. We all have that.
Yeah, and it's totally understandable. And I think the important thing to articulate here is recognition of the incredible work that has gotten us to where we are today, and everything that has happened to date needed to happen. Like, that was all part of an evolution. And now we have an opportunity to evolve our toolkit from, and understand where disclosure is useful, advocacy, internal decision making, and where we need to continue to evolve into application of accounting principles for climate-related information. And one of the things in the context of your question that has become just a litmus test is Scope 3, right? And you saw this in the SEC. You saw
So let's pause there and just define the scopes. So Scope 1 is, these gets technical. It's actually very important, and it's become actually dragged into the culture war. So just define Scope 1 and 2 and 3.
So Scope 1 are direct emissions that enter the atmosphere. They're the only emissions that enter the atmosphere. They happen when you burn, fossil fuels, when you change land to, when you're emitting carbon.
When I take a hot shower, if it's gas heated, then I'm burning.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in the process of switching that to electric, but today it's gas.
Yeah.
Okay,
Scope
I'm taking
2,
a shower. That's my Scope 1.
If your gas heat, yes. Scope 2 is emissions from your electricity purchases. So it's indirect. So it's the utility Scope 1 essentially. Mm-hmm. And then Scope 3 is both upstream and downstream in your supply chain. So wherever you sit in a supply chain, it is both everything that happened before that product or service got to you and everything that happens.
So the
after.
metal that's in if I have it, if I have a water heater, I'm not sure this is the best metaphor, but I'm going with it.
Yeah.
It's the energy that went to make the metal, right?
Yeah, copper and the steel and the trucks that shipped it around and the energy use of the manufacturing company. So what happens in the construct of scopes, which was a feature, by the way, when it was originally built, is you have this indeterminate overcounting. So you're taking scope 1 emissions through the supply chain and you're reassigning them with confusing boundaries and in a way that results in, it's not just double counting, it's an indeterminate overcounting, which, by the way, also happens when you reduce emissions. You get to count things a lot of times too. And so that was really useful when corporates weren't doing anything on climate, when we wanted to tag as many emissions as possible to companies, when you didn't have the ability to really measure and track emissions information through complex geographically dispersed supply chains. This was a good way to get started. But again, now that we're putting the pressure of moving from a voluntary system to a regulated system, and as we try and get from the billions of dollars invested to trillions of dollars invested, we need a more robust foundation.
So starting in 2027, companies operating in California with total annual revenues of over $1 billion will be required to disclose not just their scope 1, but their scope 2 and 3 as well. This is a big deal. The person who authored the law just walked through that door. So how will California's new corporate climate disclosure laws, change how companies are doing business?
Yeah. So I would separate them. I think there are two bills. There's a bill 261 that is a broader view of climate risk disclosure, which is based on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which requires companies to look at their governance, their strategy, their risk management, and then metrics and targets. That's going to, I think, change how companies do business because they're going to be forced to ask questions and staff up around climate-related conversations that just weren't forced before. Many companies are already doing that, but
most of the S&P 500 are already voluntarily doing
so
it.
it's just building the muscles. The other bill is on the metrics and target side and is specifically related to disclosure of scopes of emissions. And this is, if I to try and bring this into the contemporary conversation, I mean, if Taylor Swift were to add the 30-second song to her Tortured Poets Department album on unrequited love, or like a disappointment of expectations to reality, I think the idea that this disclosure is going to change how companies do business. I'd like to hear that Taylor Swift song, but I think that is my hypothesis, is that the way it will change how businesses operate is that they will hire a lot more consultants, lawyers, and purchase software to furnish a mass confessional of information. But whether and how it actually changes capital allocation decisions is an open question, and I think what our research shows is that what you really need is accounting to be able to change the just capital allocation decisions, and the disclosure is in this form of scopes runs the risk of climate becoming a compliance function. And I'll add one more example to this: what you're seeing with the banks who are forced to disclose now financed emissions, which is a special category of scope 3.
Right. If a bank lends to a coal-fired power plant, they have to somehow take a hit for that.
Yeah. And what they will share with us in private conversation is that they're happy to play along. They're happy to get their gold stars and do the performative reporting because they're the big ones, because they can afford it. They learned this from Dodd-Frank. We can out-comply our competitors, and we'll hire a bunch of people and we'll furnish a bunch of information. But that exercise is largely detached from the exercise of deciding where and how to invest. And you're starting to see this as, so we mentioned net zero. There's a global Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was born out of the Glasgow Climate Summit, that has organized financial institutions of different flavors under this umbrella of a commitment to net zero. And you're starting to see firms peel off from that because when rubber meets road, they don't have the incentives, they don't have the data to do it. They'll furnish reports, but they won't.
So it sounds like you're saying that there's been a whole measurement and disclosure industry that's grown up around corporate emissions, and you say that we might be doing a bunch of work, perhaps creating profits for software companies and lots of lawyers and consultants, and creating an industry and making ourselves feel good, and politicians feel like, hey, look at this, you got to lift up and show what you got. but we're not reducing emissions. We're not solving the central problem.
It's a very unpopular thing to say. Everyone wants to celebrate the good news, and I do too, and there are things to celebrate. But as someone who has the privilege of, and my background is as an entrepreneur building early ventures at emerging sectors of the economy, I've had an experience in policy through working with the state of California and New York. I have the NGO sort of background through my board service. There's nothing like being in academia, and I don't call myself an academic, to be able to observe what is going on and what is happening, what's not happening, and see the signal through the noise. And I think it's really important to take, to celebrate the wins and but to take the sober view of, we don't have a lot of time. And again, back to our book, like studying the last 30 years of climate action, it's not that people were with tented fingers going in the wrong direction. Like, they just were doing the best they could with the information that they had at the time, and the conventional wisdom, and the role, I think, of places like the Sustainable Finance Institute is to really tell the stories, do the research and analysis, publish the information to more rapidly design the innovations that will keep us making progress as we work to stay under the deadline of the climate clock that's ticking.
You use the word performative, and so you kind of think that some of these efforts are performative because we all want to think we're good people, that we're doing what we can, we're having an impact, and whether it's hosting a podcast or a radio show, or getting a report on disclosure, that we like to think like, okay, I'm doing my part. Yeah, that's a win.
Yeah.
And you're saying that our performances may not really be doing what we think they're doing.
Yeah, I am saying that with love and kindness and compassion. And look, people are busy. They know what they know. They do what they do. It's hard to see the system. And again, that's the privilege of being in the seat that I have, is you can look at the system. So again, it's not that the performers are doing it with ill intent or doing it knowing that they're doing it for performance reasons. It's people are doing the best they can with what they've got, and they're busy and they're scared and all those things.
Yeah.
Right. So it just comes back to an openness and a curiosity and a willingness to collect new information and to make course corrections. And again, this comes back to the broader tensions of being a human on this planet today, particularly in this country, of people just yelling at each other and not listening, and not, getting in their camps and getting extreme and having litmus tests, and sort of, the polarization of our discourse and our societies has made this harder, because even within, the environmental advocacy community, there's I think an unrecognized performance that is being perpetuated because it's so hard to be in that group and be confronted with an onslaught of, invitations, subpoenas to go before Congress and have to defend why climate matters.
So you teach at a law school and a business school, where it's about, hard numbers and facts. There's a saying, which if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? Though, I'm in a business where I can't always measure the impact of this conversation or anything I do. And one person said to me, well, not everything important is measurable, and not everything measurable is important. So how do you understand that, if you take off Alicia the human versus Alicia the business and law school professor, how do you bridge those two things? We have things that are very important that need to be managed, and we also have some things that are important and not measurable.
Yeah. Well, so a couple things. That's a big question. I mean, I would say that on the measurable side, you need the accounting to get the measurements right, but that enables the accountability. And then the accountability starts to look like more of this kind of symphony of, with an orchestra, and you have all the different ways you can implement accountability measures. And the good news is we're starting to see that. I mean, with the carbon border adjustments that have gone on in Europe, in the EU, that's pulling this accounting information through and holding firms accountable for their embodied emissions as they cross borders. You're seeing, there's California is a leader in climate policy that are holding various constituents, accountable in various ways, whether it's, mandates or bans on, internal combustion engines or, RPS standards.
All
like
very
that.
important
all
stuff.
Of it. So we need it all. There's no one, the silver buckshot versus the silver bullet. I think of the sort of the orchestra of activity, and a lot of that does sort of have to come in recognition of the messiness of human behavior and psychology and how communications plays a role in storytelling, and we need that all sort of we need people to line up in service of electing political officials who are open to understanding the complexities of the climate challenge and enacting effective climate policy that then aligns incentives to drive markets towards decarbonization.
Okay,
It's really easy.
So the numbers are important to help align incentives, which help get individuals do things that we kind of want to do and as in our best interest. And so the numbers are the key to helping align us with our values and with our personal and collective interests. We want to get to capital flows quickly and then audience questions. We need to go through this major transformation. We're talking a lot about, accounting. Talk a little bit about sort of, capital flows. Is it going, and maybe this gets back to your accounting reason, it's not going in the right places because the incentives are not there, but, is money going to the clean side at the rate that it needs to?
Yeah, so, gosh, more than 10 years ago, I used to have all these, this would be the first thing I'd be talking about, is the clean trillion. We were at 300 billion roughly annual spend in clean energy and energy transition, and we needed to get to $1 trillion. Now that number, in 2023, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, was 1.7 trillion. But now Lucy moved the football, and now we need to be at 4.5 or more.
And most of the new money
year.
is going to the clean side.
Yeah, that's all. That's all in
clean,
energy
yeah.
transition. So this 3x persists. But just to tease that out a little bit, and then in the context of accounting and accountability. So what has happened is on the green finance side, like the renewables and batteries and personal transportation has moved, but now we have all these other sectors that are hard to decarbonize, and and that's where you keep moving the ball.
We've done the easy stuff.
We've done the easy stuff, and by the way, that easy stuff took decades and required, was a lot of government policy. And thank you, China, for cheap solar manufacturing and RPS standards and corporate, renewable procurement. It was a lot. It was the orchestra there too. But so now we've got more ground to cover on investment, and we have to align incentives. We can't, investors don't just look to fill capital gaps and to they look to solve climate to the extent it returns capital for them.
If it makes money, we'll do it. Yeah, sure.
And so what's so elegant about accounting is, again, you can assign accountability. And so one of the things we've been working on at Stanford is once you recognize emissions as liabilities and long duration liabilities, you can start to implement the idea of a carbon balance sheet. And you can think of climate and carbon management as an asset liability matching exercise where you're maintaining a carbon balance sheet. And that then is one mechanism that would endogenize the cost of the externalities, so what you would have to pay to undo the harm of the emission, into capital allocation decisions. And so now if you move to a system like that, which can only happen with the foundation of accounting, which is why we need to start there, you can start to redirect flows of capital at a massive scale because you have the incentives.
So if we get the accounting right, we can get the money moving. I want to go to audience questions.
Yeah, can I add one more point to that?
Sure.
On the accounting? You don't just need the balance sheet, because even once you have the accounting right, you have competition to be the lower carbon supplier. And that's what we've seen through pilots of this carbon accounting work, is that companies, once they understand the embodied emissions in the materials they are procuring, they then set up supplier contracts to say, this is the number you need to beat, and companies are then competing to be the lower carbon supplier.
So you think that accounting can help reform and tame capitalism to stop it from destroying all of us and destroying itself? Okay.
Yep.
So John Tripp asks, how do we move away from only considering shareholders' wealth maximization as the driving force for business value?
Yeah, I think we've moved from it, and this is something we talk about in our class. I think there's increasing recognition of the, voice of employees, of the voice of communities, of the, broader stakeholder engagement. But I think
so. Milton Friedman's turning in his grave.
A little bit, yeah. I think, but it's gotten, but it has kind of collapsed a little bit more on itself with the politicalization of ESG and the sort of camps now of woke capitalism and all this sort of stuff. And so I think in the context of climate, we have to get back to, and the good news with climate is there is objective data that we can use around emissions, and we can use that information to make stronger cases around how to manage externalities that go beyond shareholders. And by the way, there's also the inconvenient truth that without a planet to operate on, without a stable climate, all of the assumptions that are embedded in any business's operation collapse in an unstable climate. And so that is something that people are increasingly coming to recognize. And so that creates space for more consideration than shareholder value. But I'm concerned that until we align incentives, we're going to be singing that we're going to be performing that show, but not delivering it.
Yeah, we got to. I think we need to unlearn some of the stuff we both learned in neoclassical economics about rational men and women.
Yeah.
That stuff was proven not to be true. Alicia Seiger, thank you very much for sharing your insights on measuring what matters and everything else. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.